This week, Jason Blair and I conclude our look into the Lewis Clark Valley serial killer case, doing what we did when we covered the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders, bringing in the feds. Well, one fed anyway, and a retired one, but still every bit as much of a badass. Profiler Julia Cowley of the Consult podcast is here to bring us her unique view into the profile of the man who may be responsible on this episode of Vintage Villains. Welcome to Vintage Villains, everybody. I am Allison Dickson, and here we are at part 4, the conclusion to our quartet of episodes on the Lewis Clark Valley serial killer, a very strange one, to be sure. I don't recall another case quite like this one that ties together so many different elements, victim types, and MOs, yet all seem to be convincingly linked to one unapprehended suspect. I, for one, am very glad to have the clarification that someone like Julia can offer on these complex, sprawling cases where it's all too easy to fall down a big rabbit hole and waste a whole bunch of time. Now, let's not waste any time getting into it, shall we? As always, we begin with a brief recap. Enjoy.
So in our last 3 episodes, we walked through the mysterious April 1979 disappearance of 12-year-old Christina White from Asotin, Washington. It happened on the day of the town's fair. And after spending the morning with her mom and her younger sister at the parade, Christina went to her friend Rose's house. Soon after getting to Rose's house, Christina called her mother to say that she was feeling sick, and Christina never returned home. We told you about how there were conflicting accounts of what happened once Christina had ridden over to Rose's house on her bicycle. Rose's brother Clint said that Rose was not home at the time, and Christina hung out for a while before asking you to use the phone to call her mom. Clint said that after Christina's mom told her to try to cool down a little bit, Clint gave her a washcloth, and Christina sat on the porch. Years later, Rose's mother's boyfriend, then at that point, he was Clint's stepfather, a man named Lance Voss, told investigators that he was the one to give Christina a washcloth. Neither Christina nor her bicycle were ever found. We walked you through how there was no real news in Christina's case until 3 years later, in September of 1982, when 7 miles away in Lewiston, Idaho, 3 people, 21-year-old Christina Nelson, 18-year-old Brandy Miller, and 35-year-old Stephen Parasol went missing one night from the Lewiston Civic Theater. That night, Voss was also there in the middle of the night, and we walked you through how law enforcement knew that Parasol was at the theater from reports from his girlfriend who dropped him off. But they didn't know that Christina and Brandy had been at the theater until 1984, when the 2 women's bodies were found on an embankment 35 miles to the east of Lewiston in Kendrick, Idaho. On their bodies, investigators found cords that had come from the theater. But if you jump back a few days after the initial disappearances and before Brandy and Christina were found, Voss, who was working as a janitor at the theater where Christina and Steve were also a part of the cast and crew, put himself on the radar screen of law enforcement when he went into the Lewiston Police Department and reported that he had gone out to eat after working in the theater, came back after a movie finished around 11 p.m. He had been at the Red Baron Pizzeria down the street from the theater. Christina and Brandy had walked from their apartments to a local Safeway to pick up some items, and that would have put them right on the path of where Voss was eating. However, based on the time he said he left, they would have been much earlier than his timeline would have permitted them to run into him outside. So Voss said he returned to the theater and didn't see or hear Parasol enter the theater at midnight when Parasol's girlfriend said she dropped him off to practice his clarinet and do some laundry. This was corroborated by a police officer who happened to see Parasol enter the side entrance of the theater that night. Voss said he injured himself that night while working on some equipment, laid down on a couch in the green room, fell asleep, heard a phone ring, and then eventually left to go home around 5 a.m. He said that there was nothing unusual when he woke up. Voss said he went to his home, but then he realized his wife, Pat, had to go to work around that time. So he went back to the theater. Why Voss would have returned to the theater is a bit of a mystery that is beyond me. But afterwards, although it may not be all that much of a mystery, but afterwards, Parasol's clarinet was found in the theater, which would have been uncharacteristic of him, according to his girlfriend. He had also left his car parked in front of a friend's house and an uncashed paycheck in his apartment. A police officer noted him entering, as you remember, and Parasol's clarinet was found on the sort of cover of the orchestra pit, but his case, his laundry, and a duffel bag still have not been found. At first, Parasol was a suspect in the disappearances of the girls, but over time, law enforcement concluded he was a victim. On March 22nd, 1984, so 3 days after Miller and Nelson were found on the embankment, the police brought Voss in again and interviewed him about the murders of Nelson and Miller and the disappearance of Parasol. Voss was interviewed several additional times and refused to take a polygraph. That March 22nd interview was the first time that Voss had been interviewed as a suspect.
So on May 3rd of that same year, Lewiston Police Chief Rodney Fredrickson held a news conference to confirm that the police did have a suspect that we are strongly looking to, they said. And in the press conference, he directly mentioned Miller, Nelson, and Parasol and said the suspect was being looked at in a homicide in another jurisdiction. Police in Asotin had concluded that Christina White was dead, and that even though he did not use her name, was the case that was being looked into. Soon after, law enforcement began looking at Voss for the 1981 murder of University of Idaho student Kristen David. David disappeared in late June on a bike ride between Moscow, Idaho, and Clarkston, Washington, which is Lewiston's sister city just across the Snake River. Brandy Miller had been strangled. Christina Nelson's cause of death was undetermined. Parasol and White had not been found, and Kristen David had been shot in the head with a rare bullet only made for a very rare gun that was a one-shot, which fired 2-millimeter bullets. That's 2 millimeters, and only 1,000 of these guns had ever been made. She was also dismembered, and her body parts had been dropped into the Snake River near the Red Wolf Crossing Bridge in Clarkston, about a mile from Voss's home at that time and a half mile from her destination. The first trash bag of her remains was found on July 4th. Her body parts were wrapped in several different Lewiston Morning Tribune editions from April of 1981. David also had worked at the Civic Theater. Her bicycle was never found. Police say that a profile of the suspect was done at the time David disappeared, and that the FBI had concluded that it was likely the perpetrator would continue to offend. At the time of David's death and White's disappearance, Voss was working as a mechanic at Omark, a precision tool maker that produced cutting tools for agriculture, which is also located on Snake River Avenue. Years later, a family member of Christina Nelson would link a 1963 murder of an 8-year-old Chicago girl named Diane Taylor to the other cases. She identified that Lance Voss, who was 15 years old at the time and a counselor at the YMCA, was the last person to see Taylor. Taylor had asked Voss to help unwrap a lollipop for her. He refused, and Taylor, angry, kicked him in the shin, rightly so. Days after she disappeared, her beaten, slashed, and stabbed body was found partially nude, with her blouse shoved down her throat in an alley between the YMCA building she was last seen at and where Voss lived. Chicago police said Voss was one of 3 strong suspects. Each of the victims who were found seemed to have different manners of death, but they were each missing personal items, such as wallets in cases of Nelson, Miller, and Taylor, and bicycles in the case of David and White. Each of the disappearances and murders appeared opportunistic. Law enforcement also began looking into a 1972 attempted break-in at a California mortuary where Voss was caught with a 12-inch knife, a flashlight, and a camera attempting to pry open a window to the mortuary to, according to him, visit his girlfriend one last time. The only body in the mortuary at that time was that of 17-year-old Antoinette Inino, who had drowned the day before on a beach. Antoinette's death was ruled a suicide. Her clothing was never found. We then walked you through a strange set of classified ads that Voss wrote, including a one-year one on the 1-year anniversary of Christina's disappearance that could have been a coded message about her. Another that could have been a coded reference to David. And finally, one oddly written ad that had the last names of all the victims in a 48-word ad and the first names of the two that were still missing, Stephen Pearsall and Christina White. The names were not in any particular order, but you did not have to use any letter twice to extract them from the very short classified ad. So it was just mathematically kind of astronomical as far as odds go. Voss was also the first person to find his mistress, 24-year-old Claudette Volova, dead in her apartment in Lewiston in 1987. Her death was also ruled a suicide. Voss was also interviewed after he moved out of the Lewis-Clark Valley area and the 2012 death of a 16-year-old named Kayla Campbell in Mint Hill, North Carolina. Voss was interviewed after Campbell's death by drowning had also been ruled a suicide. We walked you through how Voss had declined to give his DNA to be examined in relation to the Lewis-Clark Valley cases, but he did allow investigators to compare his DNA to evidence found in several Spokane, Washington killings that he was ultimately cleared of. We did not mention how the FBI's rules prevent Voss's DNA, assuming law enforcement has collected it, into the FBI's combined index for DNA known as CODIS, because he has not been convicted of a felony or met one of the other requirements. And that is our brief recap of this long and winding case. It's been really something, and I'm really excited for us to be able to ask Julia some questions about it. And now you have some familiarity with this one already, right? Because you were on the Snake River the Snake River Killer podcast, right, Julia?
Yeah, I talked with Brandon.
Yep.
But I will say I don't have the inside details, so I have to caveat everything that I say because I don't.
Don't you already do that?
CYA.
Julia already does that when she does know.
All the time.
Yes. Well, because it's I think it's just like psychology, profiling, we're looking at patterns and creating taxonomies for things, but there's always exceptions. And it's really, I think that's one of the important things to remember, that just like psychology and many other disciplines, they can point you in a direction. They're not going to give you the 100% answer.
It's based on probabilities, and we're looking at human behavior, which is very complex. And we're talking about a case that we don't have all the details that the police have.
Right. Correct.
So it makes it challenging to talk about it with any specificity, but certainly we can talk about themes and concepts related to it and possibilities, of course.
Well, I've got one that I don't even know whether this is really a question. So I've been interested in this case for some time. And, thinking about my career as a reporter, I saw a lot of dead people. I always had an alibi because I was not there. I was called there, but I saw a lot of dead people. But if I exclude my non-reporting life, where I was actually chasing the scene of a dead person, the grand total of people that I was the last person to see before they had an unnatural death is 0. And the grand total of people that I was the last person to see before a natural death, which was my mom, is 1. And so, assuming your job isn't in law enforcement or you're a doctor or working in an ambulance, should we or should investigators take something from a person who is repeatedly over and over a short period of time the last person to see someone before they disappeared or die? Is that like a red flag, or am I just not, am I just using my personal experience to
Well, I mean, that's what we do in profiling. We draw from our own personal experiences. We draw from our professional experiences, our knowledge, our education. Does it seem odd that someone with not a really good explanation has kind of surrounded himself with dead people or missing people? So yeah, I think that you have to consider that. Again, we're looking at the probabilities, and how many of us, as you pointed out, have multiple people where we were the last person to see them alive, unless maybe you work in an emergency room or you're a hospice nurse or you have a good reason for it. It's just, it becomes too coincidental. I can understand maybe a couple of coincidences, or if you live in a high risk environment of some kind, there has to be other possibilities. But this case, if we can trust the facts of the case, and then you really do have to consider, it seems like a very too much of a coincidence.
It's almost like the Michael Peterson on steroids situation, because when we look at the Michael Peterson case, people say, oh, 2 wives who died mysteriously on a staircase in some form or another. And people just look at that and go, oh my God, who does this happen to? And in the case of this, it's like so much more than that.
As an investigator, as an investigator in any situation like that, you would be irresponsible to not consider that. If police or investigators or anybody in the public didn't think about it, especially police, that would draw a lot of criticism. Like, you didn't even consider, and then of course there would be allegations of incompetence at best, and corruption at worst. What are you covering up if you're not considering that? So you'd be stupid not to consider it as a possibility. But when you have multiple people, like in this case, it's something you can't ignore. You can't just say, well, I've seen that before, because I haven't.
Right. I didn't even think about that high risk environments. That's, one of the things that, I looked at, like, not necessarily crime rates, because I couldn't always line up the population data, but these crimes were definitely big news, definitely big events. And like, when you looked in the articles, they were talking about like the last time there was a murder here, and in the Asotin example, it had been like decades and decades before somebody had either disappeared like that or been murdered. And so they were big events for the time. And he really was at the center of a lot of them. But I do think, and I definitely understand why it took law enforcement time to put the pieces together, because you had a 1979 disappearance 7 miles away. Maybe he was the last person, maybe he wasn't the last person. It sort of looks like he says he was the last person. And then you have the theater disappearances. Well, that wasn't next. Kristen David was the next one. But the theater disappearances, at first they didn't know that the girls had been at the theater. So you have one person at the theater who knows 2 other people who are involved in the theater. They disappear on the same night. One was at the theater, 2 were walking down to the Safeway. I could easily see how they would go in that direction. But over time, it's just become really clear that there is this connection, and then there's the other odd behavior, like the attempted mortuary break-in. But Allison, let you jump in with I know you wanted to ask about Kristen.
Oh yes. So do you want me to? Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the questions right now. In fact, I just wanted to.
I can get us started on it, because one of the things, like, it, you have a 1963 murder of Diane Taylor. That's a stabbing, slashing, beating, blouse in the throat scenario. some of her ID and wallet were missing. Then you have the 1982 murders of Christina Nelson and Brandy Miller. They don't know officially Christina Nelson's cause of death, but they do know Brandy was strangled, and they both had cords wrapped around them. So presumably that could have been the cause of death. But the one that's really different for people, and when I have conversations with people about the case, often people will say to me, well, the 1981 murder of Kristen David seems really different, right? Her cause of death, she was shot. And the disposal method, she was dismembered and thrown in bags in the river. Now, for me, I tend to say to people, like, we don't really know because we only have so many bodies, to these cases. So we don't really know that Stephen Parasol isn't dismembered in the river. I kind of assume, and we don't know about Christina White. So there's that part, but that part feels different for people. And then the gun, my gut is, for some killers, the manner of, I tend to feel like the method that they use to kill people may not always be as super important. It may be utility sometimes. And I'm not sure whether I'm right in this discussion or they're right or there's something in between.
It is the one, Kristen David is the one that people express the most doubt about. I had some questions about it. I know that Gloria Crow-Boberts, one of the investigators, she also has expressed some doubts. And I think even Kathy Belden from our episode last week as well. So is that just sort of an easy leap for people to make?
Just for the record, I firmly believe they're connected.
Oh, I know. Believe me, I know.
So what's the question?
So the question for me, okay, so another piece of background to throw in there. All of these people, Christina White was seen by the prime suspect. Stepdaughter was friend. So that's a connection beyond seeing him at the last time. He worked with Brandy, Christina, or knew Brandy and Christina and Stephen Parasol from the theater, in addition to probably being the last person who was around them. Kristen David, who is a University of Idaho student, so about 35 miles away, also in the summers worked at the theater. So that's another connection to him. Kristen, with her sort of looks like abduction and murder. The gun was used, and I'm wondering whether the different method of being killed suggests that there is a different killer.
And dismemberment.
And the different disposal method, the dismemberment.
Well, you have your MO, which modus operandi, which is the what an offender does to successfully commit a crime. And it's practical, it's dynamic, it can change. It is based on learned behavior. Offender learns something works one time, may not work another time. So that could be things such as the tools used to commit a crime or the weapon used to commit a crime. So that could be part of MO. Method of escape could potentially be part of MO. Timing you're going to commit your crime. So these are all maybe decisions that would go in, whether or not they're going to wear gloves to, successfully commit the crime and not leave fingerprints. What we don't know is, in a lot of these cases, we don't have a lot of evidence. And then you have the ritualistic behavior, the ritual part of it, which is the behavior that an offender needs to engage in to satisfy the needs for the crime. So in looking at some of these crimes, dismemberment, we actually don't know if that's MO or ritual, because what we do know is Kristen David, witnesses say they saw her with somebody. So perhaps the offender thinks, I need to get rid of her because I believe I've been spotted with her. So I need to get rid of all the evidence. So he takes that extra time, because a lot of time and effort put into dismembering somebody and wrapping them up and getting rid of them, a lot of extra unnecessary time. So is it because it's his perception he's been spotted, and he wants to create time and distance between himself and the victim in case somebody spotted him? So he's not going to leave her where she is. He's going to get rid of her. So that could be practical. That could be part of MO. And it can change because in this instance, something happened during the commission of the crime that maybe changed his plans. And plans can change. You may have a plan and it may change just based on the interaction with the victim, what is going on around you, car drives by. So we just don't know why that was done. So I would not necessarily say that's part of ritual. And we don't know if other victims were dismembered. And if some are not dismembered, it may just mean because he didn't feel he needed to.
Right.
He felt safe and he could.
You said time. It takes time. Yeah.
And he took his time. Whoever did it took their time. Yeah.
And ritual behavior is not dynamic. It is consistent. And in fact, but I mean, it doesn't change. It's consistent and it's repetitive. And that's what you see when you're seeing these certain types of offenders, this ritual behavior. And then you have signature, which is kind of the combination of the two. And it's hopefully unique enough to link crimes together through behavior. So just an example, burglar goes into a house, they have crowbars, they have tools, they steal some things. That's all MO. But then they go around the house and they rearrange everything. That becomes more ritual.
It's like totally unnecessary. Yes.
Would the manner in which the body was dismembered maybe add some weight? Like if she was very skillfully dismembered and neatly wrapped versus somebody who was kind of just, I hate to be crude, but like hacked up and just tossed.
I don't want to say that funny, but I hear that all the time. We hear that, they were so skilled in how they dismembered the body. It doesn't mean they have any experience at it. I mean, people used to say that Jack the Ripper must have been a physician of some sort. And it really turns out it's kind of, I don't want to say intuitive, but
I think about the first time I cut a turkey, right? Like, did you like really get a lot of bone in the turkey?
Right.
Eating bone?
I never put a lot of weight in unless there's something specific that a doctor points out that, this has to have like, a lot of skill involved in this particular person. So it doesn't necessarily mean to me if somebody says, they were neatly cut up and they have to have skill. They're just, I know this sounds kind of gross, but it's stuff we think about in the behavioral analysis world. There are places that you would normally and intuitively separate parts of a body from the torso, for example. So I just wouldn't put a lot of weight in that. Now, when we look, for example, the case of Mark Twitchell, who he had fantasies of, his fantasy was to kill somebody and kill them very quickly and then spend his time dismembering the body. And that was the ritualistic behavior. The MO is killing them and setting up the room, getting that all done. But this need to spend a lot of time. So that while it served a practical purpose of getting rid of the body and disposing of it and putting the body into sewer drains, the act itself was really very ritualistic to him. So there's could be a difference. Now, when a spouse kills somebody and they chop them up, put them in a suitcase, that's not necessarily ritual. That's practical. So there is a blurred line sometimes between MO and ritual. So just the fact, like a good example, Joe D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer. I talk about this case all the time because there's so much rich behavior that I think was initially misinterpreted, but he goes around ransacking the house, and you would think, well, that's practical because he's looking for things and he wants to steal things. He's a burglar. So that just is practical. But when you see that this is repetitive behavior, he spends a lot of extra time. He makes a lot of noise. He doesn't really take things necessarily of value. He moves things around. Then you start to get into that ritualistic realm. So
if you were looking at, let's say, a dismemberment and looking to see if it was ritualistic, you would look for things like it taking a lot of time, things being done that seem unnecessary in repeated spaces, where you're looking for something about it that's not practical.
Right. And that's very hard. It's hard to tell sometimes. Yeah. Is this practical purposes or not? Like, people might think that Mark Twitchell's case, in that case, it was all practical. But when you read his writings, you see it was ritualistic. So it's not always, it wouldn't necessarily be evident just because you look at the crime scene. You need to have kind of insight into them and what they were hoping to accomplish and what their fantasies were. So we just don't know. And then the changing of weapons. I mean, again, just because someone's changed weapons does not mean they're not the same offender. And that again could be, perhaps they just didn't have the weapon, their chosen weapon, with them at the moment when they decided to find a victim. They see a desirable and vulnerable victim. They want to take the opportunity, but let's say they don't have their gun, so that time they use a knife. Or you often don't know how is the victim going to react, and the offender reacts accordingly. So victim fights back. Let's say the offender intended to sexually assault them, victim fights back, and then he ends up just shooting the person, and there's no sexual assault. So that shows how MO could change.
So it would be important in looking at a crime not to assume that the offender had a plan and that on all of them, the offender executed the plan, and we should see the same.
Exactly.
They're human beings, not robots.
It can make it really difficult. If you don't have, all these cases are are difficult when you have an offender that changes their MO or changes, it's the ritual part. The problem with the ritual part, when you don't have all the bodies, or there's been a significant amount of time before you find the bodies, and you can't glean all the information about what actually happened, that makes it difficult to really maybe see what the ritualistic behavior is. And for the purpose, and sometimes the ritual, there may not really be any more ritual than I want to kill someone, and that satisfies my fantasy. I don't need it to be prolonged. I don't need to do it in a certain way. And then you have other offenders that have very specific ways they want to do things, and that kind of behavior is much easier to link crimes together. Well, this is one of the most challenging cases of doing linkage analysis.
Because it's very, like the link is a much more...
Too many missing pieces of the puzzle, really.
You know what it also reminds me of when you're looking at some of this stuff? Well, I guess there are two things I wanted to ask, but let me ask this one first. It reminds me of the Courier case with Israel Keys and Samantha Koenig out in Alaska. There's the distance between the two cases that instantly would make you think there's no way these two things are connected, or I'd have to find the guy who just, lives in Alaska half the year and Vermont the other half of the year. And with the Couriers, you don't have the bodies, but really, even if you did, Bill Courier, supposedly, at least according to Israel Keys, was shot. I forget how he said Lorraine was killed, but maybe it was strangulation or something along those lines, I think. But it's just, I guess it reminds me of those in the sense that sometimes when you're looking for, like, I look at Israel Keys and I think to myself, the only real common thing I find thread in his killings is he really loves to cause people to disappear. And he might be a necrophiliac based on what he's saying. And it kind of putting the similarity between all these disappearances and Keys to me, to be clear, everyone, he was not born. He wasn't killing people at that time. But it's an they were, assuming they're all crimes, they were all very opportunistic. Picking up a girl who's taking a ride on a bike on the highway. Unless, someone knew Brandy and Christina were going down to Safeway, no one else knew Stephen was going back at midnight. Christina White just showed up at Rose's house. That unless somebody was stalking them all for a while, it was like a spur of the moment plan. Someone had a plan to do something and people walked into their spider web. I get that kind of feeling. And for me, it's kind of, it makes me feel like it's really easy in those opportunistic crimes, even if you have a plan, if something goes wrong, like Stephen Parasol walking into the theater, your ritual may go out the window too. Your signature may go out the window. And then it just becomes all about getting away with it. Is that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think that the age differences in the victims point to anything in particular? I mean, we do have, his earliest alleged victim being 8 years old, but he was also 15 at the time. But they continue to be like a little older as you go. Christina White being 12, and then Nelson and David and the others. Pearsall was the oldest at 35. Is there anything that you would have to say about in terms of when you look at crimes like these to see a variance in age difference, or is that just another kind of depends?
One thing to throw in there about Parasol, though, but he is definitely a person who was not supposed to be there.
Right. I mean, well, he's also the only male.
And he may have walked in. That's what I'm wondering.
Right.
Walk in on a crime. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the difference in ages would be something that I would consider as differences in these cases, but I would never say a case wasn't linked because there was a wide range of ages, because we've seen so many cases where you have a significant range of victims' ages. So I wouldn't rule it out. I would look at other things and then just age. Age is always a consideration, of course. Age, gender, race.
Right.
I mean, you consider every characteristic of that victim. And that's another thing about this case too. Victimology is really important, and for the most part, kind of collective victimology, they were low risk, and that also makes it even more interesting that they came into contact with the same individual and they disappear. It's not like they are all living high risk lifestyles.
Okay, that's what I meant. Like, so if they were, say, sex workers or something, or hitchhiking or something like that, that would be more of a high risk situation.
Yeah, I just they're all low risk. They've come into contact with the same person, so that is a consideration for sure. And
yeah.
Every single one of them. But, and I don't know every detail about their backgrounds, but collectively, I would say that they were pretty low risk. Maybe, what elevated their risk was perhaps the situation they found themselves in, away from their homes and in the vicinity of someone who was looking to do others harm. So
Right.
that's kind of what I see as like elevating their risk in a case like this.
That's an interesting thing. They were all isolated a bit from their home. Like every one of them, Diane Taylor throughout. Here's one sort of like a loop. So he's a prime suspect in the case. And then we have this sort of outlying drowning from the 1970s. And I know there's going to be a temptation for people to think, oh, he must have killed her. But one of the things that I went back and I looked at, I wanted to know before he broke in or was caught breaking into the mortuary, had it been in the newspaper that she had died? And it had been in the newspaper that she had died. It had not been in the newspaper what mortuary she was at yet, but so it did make the news, and her picture was in the newspaper. But can we glean anything about a person based on that situation, which was he was caught taking a screen off the back of the mortuary with a 12-inch knife, a camera, and a flashlight. And he told the police officer who was there that he was going to go visit his girlfriend for the last time. There was no known association, so we don't know whether he knew her or not, or whether that's just what he said. He also lied about his address, but they eventually found him and got him. But is there anything we can glean from that kind of behavior?
No, I think it's totally normal behavior.
Oh, you do? Yeah. Well, I was planning on going on doing it next week.
Yeah. What do you mean?
I guess what said.
I met my husband. Yeah, as one does.
I mean, good Lord. So what I take from that is, I guess is the overview. Without being able to directly link her to him, maybe he saw her in the paper and found her desirable or attractive. And, because what we don't know is if when he killed victims or when, we can't say for sure that he did it, but let's just say he killed the other victims. And so why would he go break into the morgue? What we don't know about him is what he did with the victims when he had them. So is his goal that he wants them dead right away so that he can do what he wants with them after they're dead, such as back to Mark Twitchell. So that's what we don't know. Is that an attraction for him? Is that the ritual? Is that what he's hoping to have the ultimate control over somebody by interacting in a sexual manner of some kind with somebody who's deceased, with a deceased body? So, I would question that behavior, and I would really wonder if he had interacted with potentially any other bodies, and was he killing them to interact with them, or is it just possible in this particular case he just wanted to, he didn't need to kill them but still wanted to interact with a dead body? I mean,
and that kind of leads me to sort of the next question is, because one thought that I had possibly is, he seems like a trophy collector. Whoever this person is that seems to be linked to all these victims, is that they're all missing a lot of the similar items. They're all like the bicycles, the IDs, things like that. So I almost wondered if maybe he was interested in collecting a trophy of some kind from this person as well.
Maybe.
What that could be, who knows? But what can we derive, do you think, about the kinds of killers who, and this is going to segue into the next topic a little bit, to leave behind things like notes or classified ads or other breadcrumbs that sort of draw the public's attention versus the ones that try to avoid any and all detection? You have ones that just don't ever want to be found. And then some guys like Zodiac or BTK or, possibly this guy.
And also maybe, and I don't know if this is connected, so it may not be a part of the question. Also, I kind of look at it too in the context of somebody who constantly, in his case, we know he's responsible for the classified ads because of the records related to it and the phone numbers, but he inserted himself into the Christina White case, and it seems like made up a story about searching for her and went to the police on his own. After the Civic Theater, he went to the police on his own. I'm like, you're kind of
a little Kemperish, you know.
But no, but like almost in this like sticking it in your face kind of way. Like, this is the vibe I get from listening to the small part of the interrogations. It felt like, and I've been on both sides of these kinds of conversations, where or I know that I did X, but we both know you can't prove it kind of feeling.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing we can say, I think, with certainty, whether he's responsible or not responsible, he likes to play games.
Yeah.
He's manipulative. Because, good Lord, if he did not do these crimes, he's sure drawing attention to himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I take from it. He likes to play games with people. He likes to manipulate them. He likes to control them. This is ritual behavior. This could be, I should say, ritual behavior. It actually probably is, whether he's the offender or not the offender. But, inserting himself potentially in an investigation to be in proximity to it. We've seen that before with people who actually did it and many people who didn't do it. And they always draw attention to themselves. Like, right. Who's this guy showing up here? Why is he so interested? And it turns out they really are just a good Samaritan. They become the number one suspect and their whole lives get ruined. But
right.
I mean, what I take from it is he likes to play games. He likes to manipulate people. This is like a chess game to him. And he's like, it's like, I'm going to make a move and the police make their move and then he moves it back. Well, now I'm not going to. And he gets great satisfaction and enjoyment out of that and manipulating. And if he did commit the crimes, he probably thinks he's smart enough that no one's ever going to figure out. So he can play these games with them. And it's probably quite gratifying for him. I'm smarter than you and I'm going to show you, and you're not ever going to catch me. And he's getting a lot of enjoyment out of that. Again, whether he killed them or not, he's still getting a lot of enjoyment by toying with the police.
Yeah, because I think about it either. I don't know if it disturbs me more if he did it and is playing those games or if he didn't, because they're both sadistic, but it's particularly sadistic if you're not the one who did it.
Yeah, so it is sadistic behavior, which would be in line with a murderer. But there are a lot of sadistic people who engage in sadistic behavior that never kill anybody or never do anything violent. So, right. That's what that tells me about him. And it really does speak to him thinking he's smarter than everybody else. Either way, whether he's a killer or not, he thinks he's just smarter and he's just messing with people.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I could see a scenario where a person who is sadistic is accused or appears to be a murderer. And most of us, would work hard to clear ourselves, or we'd lawyer up, or we'd do whatever. But it would be like, if you were an innocent person, I could see even a sadistic person who's innocent using something like this just to mess with people. And that scares me as much, because if you aren't a murderer, it makes me think you have the potential, because you clearly do not care about the enormous amount of harm it's going to cause to the investigation. It's going to point things in the wrong direction. It's that part of it to me is I wish I knew more about his education and his childhood and how he did in school and stuff like that, because there seems to be some need to prove that you're smarter, which is why his dome house always gets me. Reinventing the house in a dome circular form for me just strikes me as somebody who thinks they're just brilliant.
It's a very quirky thing. There are people that live in those things. My husband and I watch a lot of alternative housing type videos, and yeah, those dome houses are just, you have to be into a certain quirkiness, I think, to want to live in something like that.
The ads he ran about it were like display ads in the newspaper about how he was reinventing housing.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's all him.
Think about it with this guy, though. You have, and this is why he's a main suspect, because he's been tied to several victims. And imagine you become the main suspect, and you just happen to be a very sadistic game player who likes to manipulate, and what are the chances of that?
Lucky you.
He also,
I guess it could be, but
hey man, you just lucked out. He just lucked out.
He also got involved in a lot of local politics in a way that wasn't almost kind of adversarial. He wouldn't he fought the drawdown of the reservoir and the around the Snake River area. That seemed a little odd because it was just there wasn't really a good reason for him to.
I can think of another reason to fight the drawdown.
Well, a good public a reason you wouldn't want to admit to in public. But also he ran for a city council position. He just really likes to put himself in front of people. He plays, he's in these big plays, plays the bad guy in a few of them. He definitely thinks of himself quite highly. Wrote some class assignments and writing assignments that were really sadistic as well in nature. So there's a lot to suggest.
That's what
y'all are saying.
A little bit, and not that he had that many victims, but the case of Stephen Pankey. And I know, Jayson, you probably heard of it because you had Ed Densel, or you've talked with Ed Densel. And he covered the case on his show. He interviewed Steve Pankey. Ultimately, Steve Pankey was convicted of the murder of Jonelle Matthews. And a lot of the evidence they had against Steve Pankey, it's not nearly as compelling in my mind as maybe some of the stuff against Voss, but he kind of inserted himself into things, but he was an odd guy. He was in politics. His ex-wife, discussed him being very dangerous person. But it kind of reminds me of that, like a little bit like Steve Pankey, like.
Yeah, and his ex-wife, I don't know if you read this story, but one of his ex-wives talks about, they've got great stories, but one of them is he wouldn't do the dishes around the house. And she asked him to do the dishes one night, and he grabbed the dishes, took them up the hill, and shot all the dishes.
Yeah.
Oh, I remember you mentioning that.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm convinced. Right?
Yeah. But the evidence against Pankey was, almost entirely based on his odd behavior, and which is kind of strange, but
kind of similar. Yeah. Well, I've got an odd behavior for you, but maybe it's not odd. But I find this really, really odd. So he ends up on law enforcement's radar screen because of the Civic Theater, and he refuses to take the polygraph. Okay. Which I get why some people wouldn't want to. It wouldn't be my instinct, but I get why some people wouldn't want to. He gets a lawyer. The lawyer tells the law enforcement to stop asking him questions or we'll consider this harassment. Then a couple years later, there are a bunch of murders in, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, it's Spokane? Is that it? Spokane, Washington, right?
Samantha's going to come get you.
I know. So there are these murders in Spokane, and he is willing to give his DNA under only the terms it can only be used on that case, and it can't be used on any of the Lewiston and Clarkston cases.
That's insane.
I find that really, really odd. I find that you might as well at that point write me a note that says you did it. So I found that part of it odd. Now, maybe a person could do it just because they're mad at investigators or whatever it is. They could have reasons, but I find that odd. So you fast forward and he moves to North Carolina. A 16-year-old girl named Kayla Campbell, who lives near him, disappears, is found drowned in a pond. It's ruled accidental, an accidental death. But the FBI finds out that he's a neighbor and decides to bring him in to interview him. And before this, he's lost membership in a gun club and a country club because of this. His wife, because of the attention on him, had to leave a job that she had to in North Carolina. All these bad things have happened in life because he's a suspect. I would think somewhere around that point, you would want to do everything you could to clear yourself because there's been real cost or consequence. So I'm just wondering whether things like that DNA scenario or not making the efforts that he could have to kind of clear himself tell you anything. I just find that DNA thing very weird. You can only use my DNA here.
Yeah. I mean, if he hadn't been in close proximity to so many victims, I might say I think he's just playing a game, just being difficult and manipulating the police and, just trying to cause them more issues. But it, because he's tied to all of it, you have to find that behavior being very suspicious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it really just piles up on him, to the point where you just can't ignore everything and think he's not a good suspect. I mean, in my opinion, I think he is properly prioritized as the number one suspect.
Now, if he was ever arrested, I know this is more of a legal question than anything, and I understand if none of you can answer it, but if he were arrested on some other felony not related to this, would they then be able to put that DNA into CODIS for use elsewhere, or is it really?
No.
Yeah, I'm curious about.
So I think Brett and I were having a conversation.
It's convicted, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. He has to be convicted of the felony. Okay.
I don't understand, and the rules vary also from state to
state. Yeah, that's what
confusing.
Yeah, Brett was telling me that it's the rules of the state determine when it can be collected, and then the FBI has its own rules about what standard it has to meet to be able to be collected, both scientifically and otherwise. How many markers, other stuff like that.
Right.
But from what Brett had said, that you have, if you have not, there's not a scenario really for your DNA to get in there if you are not a missing, unidentified person, murdered person, or have been convicted or arrested at least for a felony. Like there's not a state where it'll end up in there.
Okay.
So
and unknowns can go in from crime scenes.
Yep. Unknown
as well.
Yeah, right. For comparison to them, I left that part out. But I think the interesting thing on the DNA side, I have to believe by now they've collected his DNA, and I have to believe by now he probably knows they have collected his DNA. But it just feels like a giant great game to me, like that the whole, which makes me wonder. Okay, here's one. It makes me wonder whether like that is actually a part of the ritual and the signature is the game playing afterwards. Like that is the real fantasy.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely is. And it prolongs everything for him.
Yep.
It's just maddening because I feel like in every one of these scenarios, there's just one missing piece. There's like one piece we could get to fall into line, and then it would just kind of domino down in a lot of ways, but we're just shy of that one linchpin. It feels like
when I went to Lewiston, I had this is the last conversation with Gloria I had with, we were actually sitting in the parking lot between the FBI residence agency and the hotel I was at. And she was saying like, I just want to harass him and drive him crazy. And I'm like, but maybe that's the thing for him. Maybe that is what he wants. Like you to go mad, going after him, harassing him, and you still not being able to get him. So you have this weird scenario for her, I think, of where like her trying to make all these efforts to bring attention to the case, to law enforcement, to try and pin him down, actually like heighten the high for this. It's so uncomfortable to even think about because we've all become a part of his fantasy. Right?
Yeah. Well, it's all high risk behavior, and he thrives on high risk behavior.
Right.
Clearly.
Yeah. Because if I got kicked out of my country club, I haven't been a member of one. But if somehow I cared about that and was in one, and I was in a band and I got kicked out, and my wife lost my job, I'd be like, you know what? It's time to do something about this.
Yeah, here, take my DNA, test it, get it out of your system,
or even just stop playing games.
It's right? It's funny because I
can... Allison, another odd piece of this is after telling the police in Lewiston, I'm done, you're harassing me, I don't want to be interviewed, why did he volunteer for the interview with the FBI in North Carolina?
Yeah.
He didn't lawyer up. Was the game not as fun for you?
He was bored.
Yeah, possibly bored. It could be the situation, the agent involved, the investigator. I mean, it could be a number of factors.
Also, I have factor in the fact that he's turning 77 this year. He's gotten pretty old. I know he looks strong. He seems pretty hale for his age, by what people have been able to gather. But I would imagine if he is feeling physically limited in any way, that he has to find some way to keep that high coming, even if he can't, say, kill anybody else.
See, I'd throw it around the exact opposite way. The murder is huge for us because taking human life is such a big deal and it's so precious. But like for somebody who is, let's say, sociopathic and sadistic, who's killing people very quickly, probably based on what we've seen, he's not sitting there torturing them or whatever it is, right? So like, where is he getting his high? Is he getting his high from screwing with everyone else? For us, the murder is the big deal, but what if the murder is just like the thing that has to happen to get what I really want on the other side? And I think of things like he shows up at the crime scene where Diane Taylor's body is found in 1963, where we didn't exactly have the internet and you weren't getting news alerts on your phone. You very quickly show up at the crime scene, end up in a newspaper photograph on the front page of the local newspaper. Like maybe that is it. Maybe all the killing is just a way to get to the game plan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It would not be the first time that I've seen that. So
really, are there cases that are known that are a bit like that, or not known? Or
pardon?
Are there any cases like that are well known?
I would definitely the Twitchell case.
Oh yeah,
and you see it in arson.
I was going to say too, people like Dennis Nilsen and even Jeffrey Dahmer, they weren't into the killing; they were into the companionship that came from the corpses. So they didn't take any pleasure out of the kill. It was more like a means to the goal, or the product that they were trying to get from the kill.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and arson can be sometimes a bit like terrorism, right? Like, can you get that high afterwards and the catch me if you can?
Yeah, the watching it and watching the response to it and all of that is, and not every offender wants to do that. Some offenders probably never pay attention to the news, and others follow it very closely and they follow the investigation very closely. It's all, dependent on that individual.
Yeah.
They're all different.
Yeah.
They really are.
Right. And I know it's really weird to say to people and strange to say to people that like the murder may not be the important part for an offender. But I think sometimes we have this bias because murder is so huge for us. Like we wouldn't do it. We're not like big fans of it. We're trying not to kill anyone. It's such a big thing for us. I think we assume sometimes that the worst crime is the big thing for them.
It's all about, they're just trying to get their power trip however they can. And either it comes from the immediate act or the after act.
Yeah.
The aftermath.
Or you're asking, why would they do that? Because that increases their risk, or why? And, and you have, that's because that's the ritual part of it.
Right.
The reaching out to the police, writing letters. Sometimes they'll talk to the media. I've seen killers standing right outside the crime scene being interviewed by the media.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
So that has happened.
Wow.
And then other cases, the murder itself is done and they don't need to have any further communication with anybody. They're not going to reveal themselves. They don't want to reach out to family members. They just don't care about that part of it. That's not what was important to them. It's such, murder and these fantasies are so personal and individualistic.
Right.
And no serial killer is the same.
One weird one for me that baffles me about the story, which may have been a game, may not have been a game. But like in looking at things like the classified ads, I look at this very differently now. So when Christina White disappeared, and they're unsure whether it was a couple days or a couple weeks, there's some conflicts in the police records. But at some point in the months after she disappeared, her homework papers were found about 6 miles away, and they were in excellent condition. Like
stacked very neatly. Yeah.
Yeah. And her friends' homework papers were also in there. So hers and her friends from school. Christina disappeared on a weekend. So if she had her friends' homework papers, chances are, they came from school the previous week. But they were on a farm where Rose, Lance's, eventually his stepdaughter, kept her horse. Now, that day, Christina was supposed to go over and help Rose with her horse, but she wasn't there, which is also very weird. How did she get that bad information? But the idea of homework is really weird because she didn't bring a bag over there. She didn't, there isn't a real good reason she should have had it on that day.
Yeah.
But the homework was found neatly stacked on a farm. And like
in a horse trough.
Yeah. And part of, well, it wasn't it was on the edge of it. It was on
the edge of it. Okay.
It was on a stump on the edge of it by the horse trough. And to me, the thing there is someone stacked those papers and put them there. Whether it was him or it was someone else. But once I started reading the classified ads, I started thinking, like, maybe this isn't just a weird thing where they fell out. Maybe this is a part of the game. Is there anything that we could draw from that or think about related to that?
I'm just trying to think practically, how did he get them? I mean, if I had to say what was most plausible, she had them with her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And people just don't remember that she might have had, or they're just assuming she would not have had them with her.
Or she may have taken a bag with her.
That people just don't recall that she would have had a bag. I mean, it's easy for us to say, well, she would not have had a bag that day. But right. Do we know for sure she didn't have a bag? So that would be the most practical thing, that he had the bag and he just ended up taking them to the farm and putting them there.
My only other suggestion in that too is that because she and Rose were so close that maybe they, had some of each other's school stuff,
right.
If they were doing homework at each other's house, or they got folders mixed up, or so it's possible that some of her belongings were in Rose's possession, which then Voss could have got.
Here's another option, putting on my high risk hat. So Rose's house is on a corner is it 2nd Street or 3rd Street? I can't remember which one. Voss has whichever the opposite is, Voss has an empty house there. You kind of like pass where that is and then take a right and go up a hill, and that's where Christina's house is. Another possibility is that whoever the killer was walked her home, and that was the plan at first. And when they realized her mom was out on errands before coming to pick her up, then the plan was executed.
Yeah.
There are a lot of ways in my mind, but the fact that the homework papers ended up
at there
the farm by where Rose's horse was, that seems to be like pointing a neon light at you too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But also pointing a light at other people in a weird way, because, the guy Carl Flynn, who runs the Flynn farm, also, it could be in a weird way pointing away from you because it makes it look like she made it home. And then, it just seems like another game to me.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely fits
Quite
in with
possibly.
that.
I don't know. I don't have an answer.
That one is probably one of the most baffling clues in this entire story, is that homework stack.
And when we find out, if we ever find out, it's probably going to feel so obvious.
Yeah.
It could just be like, I don't know why I did it.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a reason. It could be that too. I mean, I have so many questions for Joe D'Angelo. Just why this, or did you do this? There are just so many things that have been assumed about him, or said about him, or things that I know that he did that I don't have an answer as to why he did it. And, I would love to sit down and ask him. He's never talked with anybody, but some of those answers could be like, I had no reason. I don't know why I did that. And there's no meaning behind it. And sometimes some of the cases that you look at and you're just wondering why, and it could just be nothing. Or you do end up hearing the story and the answer is so much less sensational than what you imagined it would be. Because we put all, our biases on other people and what we think everything must have meaning to them. Everything they are doing is diabolical and thought out and well planned and well executed, so we are putting that on them, and when in fact it's probably not that way most of the time.
Right.
So I guess, we've probably asked about as many questions as we could come up with, but I did have one more to just kind of wrap it up, more of a general question, because in part 1 of the series, I did a little brief bit in the intro talking about the quote golden age of serial killers between the period of 1970 and 2000. And I discovered that criminologist Peter Vronsky wrote a book that drew a correlation between this peak of serial killers to those who grew up during a time of intense wartime, World War II in Korea, for instance. And a lot of people were coming home from battle with mental struggles and addictions that led to violence and broken homes. There seemed to be a pretty strong correlation in that direction of the children of these people, these men generally that came home from the war with troubles. Do you feel that's a legit correlation in your mind, or do you think there are other correlations that could explain this influx of serial murder at the time that Lance Voss, for instance, was quite active?
Hey, Allison, if I could jump in real quick,
Allegedly quite active. Sorry.
Right. I had a friend of mine who once said, this is a police detective in New York. He said, well, after the Korean War, serial killers needed something to do. He really just believes like war is great for, if you want to kill people, it's a great thing to do.
mean, and that's the thing, it's separating it from the people that were in the military themselves. Like, these are their kids that grew up. So the Ted Bundys, the John Wayne Gacy's, the Richard Ramirez's, the children of these people.
Yeah, I think his point was the serial killers of the next generation had nowhere to go.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I mean, well, see, and then of course the dwindling of that over time, better investigative tools, better, means of.
Well, I was going to say that's the time where the behavioral science unit is becoming very active and interviewing people and understanding serial murder. So maybe we're identifying more, and there's not necessarily an increase. We just know more about it. Technology is getting better, things like that. I don't know. I mean, that's pretty complex. I don't know that. And I think it's controversial as well. Can you really directly correlate? Now, I wouldn't be surprised if you see an increase in violence, but serial murder type violence, when I talk about the serial murder, you may have somebody who has killed multiple people, but it's not your typical, what we think of serial murders out there, stalking and preying on unknown people for sexually motivated reasons. As opposed to maybe somebody involved in domestic violence that
right.
have something like that. That's a little different type of violence in my mind. Or I don't want to say that wouldn't necessarily, they would still be labeled serial killers, but their motivations would be very different. So when I think of serial killer, I think of the sexually motivated type of serial killer for the most part. I mean, there's other motivations, but the classic serial killer. So I just think it's hard. I mean, perhaps experience more violence in their home, maybe help to fuel their fantasies and, caused or at least accelerated the, combining violence with sexual fantasies. And
right.
maybe that's the reason. So you see people that might not have acted out in a serial manner end up acting out that way. I think it's too complex for me to answer whether or not I think it's a valid correlation, it would not surprise me that when you have people coming back from war that have experienced so much trauma, that there would be an increase in violence and violent crime. Now, the classic serial murder, I don't know. I think we were getting better at maybe identifying them and who they were and understanding it better.
That makes sense.
But I don't know. I mean, I didn't do a whole study on it like this criminologist did and go back. And that's a whole area of expertise in terms of war and stuff like that I just don't have knowledge of.
Yeah. So I've got one more. What steps could you imagine, right? Because we don't have all the information, but with the information we do have, what steps could you imagine, in the hypothetical with what we have, you would think, or what steps do you think might be important for investigators to take now?
Well, this would be a very boring answer, but this is a very practical answer, going through every single bit of evidence and seeing what could possibly be tested or retested, because there have been advances. And I recently just learned of a case, very old case. They went back and retested something that had been tested long ago, and they found evidence on it. So, that had been tested. So retesting things, seeing if they're, they can identify things with more sensitive testing that we have in this day and age. That's just a very boring, practical answer. In collecting that type of information, I would, again, be doing very detailed timeline. And also, you don't have much time left with your main suspect here. So
right.
Trying to craft some kind of interview strategy with him, just in going in extremely prepared and, studying him and trying to understand him and coming up with the best strategy to try to get him to tell the truth and provide more information about what he knows about these crimes. But that's what I would be doing. I would be studying him and learning everything I can about him, talking with people and trying to come up with the best strategy, not only the best strategy, but who to conduct the interview. Try to understand, why was it that he would talk to a particular FBI agent, but he wouldn't talk to another investigator? What was it? What was it about the approach? What was it about the interviewer's characteristics? Where was he at the time? What was going on in his life at the time? What was the subject matter exactly that they approached him? It's like all these things could come. You want to see what worked in the past and what didn't work and why, and try to recreate that.
So almost starting with really understanding his motivation to talk, and then, or whatever barriers got in the way, and then crafting a really strong, because you're right, like he clearly has sent the message throughout all this that he's willing under certain circumstances to engage.
But what exactly is about those circumstances?
Right.
That's what I wanted, because we have a little bit, like he talked, well, why? He talked to that FBI agent. Was it, did he just like the person, or what did they say to them? Or where was he right at the moment he was approached? Was he in a vulnerable situation that made him vulnerable to law enforcement right at that moment?
Kind of reminds me of the Lloyd Lee Welch interrogation, Jayson, like the way the police were able to wiggle their way in through various rapport building and understanding his vulnerabilities to finally crack that nut. It took quite a while and a lot of people, in fact, to get it done.
And entertaining, one of the things in the Welch case was I felt like they made the most progress when they left him feeling as if he was advising them on who the potential suspect was. And they really weren't sure, him at that point. But it was very fascinating how they were able to use those techniques in that case.
Yeah. And also knowing he's not going to do anything that is not a benefit to him. But we can't assume what he would think would be a benefit to him. Right. You have to understand what does he want? What would benefit him at that moment, at that point in time in his life?
And I think though, maybe we do know part of what he wants. He wants to play a game.
Yeah.
And maybe that's.
They have to turn it into a game. Hook them up to a VR machine.
I don't think they have to worry about that. You just let them do it.
No kidding.
Yeah, interviewing is it's an art form. And, I was recently asked by someone if, if I thought I was a good interviewer. And I said, in some situations I am. Yeah. So some situations I'm not. Like, you're not always the right interviewer because it's your case, or you and I might be very good in certain situations, and in other situations I'm not the right interviewer, and I'm not going to do as well, and I'm not going to have success. So part of being a good interviewer is understanding when you shouldn't be the interviewer, and you're not going to do well in all situations. And that changed over time in my career. When I was younger, there were certain interviews that I didn't feel comfortable doing. I didn't think I would do a very good job. As I got older and became a senior agent, I felt much more comfortable in doing certain types of interviews that I would not have done as well in when I was younger. And that comes from a lot of reasons. And sometimes it's just the difference in age between you and the person you're interviewing. And, being older and more experienced might work to my advantage in one situation, and being younger and being new might work to my advantage in another situation. So there's so much that goes into it. And I think it's one of those things that sometimes we overlook how important it is. And I think what they forget too, we watch these videos of interrogations. People do not know how hard they are.
Right.
I mean, you are on, and you are trying to think on your feet, and what am I going to get? How am I going to get this person to talk to me? And people are watching you usually on the video, real time when you're doing it. It is really hard. Yeah. It is hard. You have, all these things you're trying with this particular person, but going in prepared is the best way. But, I think a really good interview someday with him, if they can get him to sit down at some point.
Yeah. It's maddening.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. This is really helpful. This has been great conversation. I think I've been waiting to have this conversation ever since I started looking into the case. So,
well, you've been talking to me about it for, a while now, a couple years, maybe.
Yes.
That sounds right. I just know you started sending me all these things.
Sounds familiar.
He's just obsessed.
No, I'm honestly so glad, because you just started showing me the classified ads and you were kind of filling in details and stuff. And I'm like, if I didn't already know you well enough and know you to be a relatively sane person, I would be like, what happened, man? You're just connecting all these dots like on the whiteboard.
Like, no, really, for real, man.
No, but it's fascinating.
When he went out west, I said, be careful, don't drink out of the water bottle they hand you. They might think you're a suspect.
No doubt.
I'll never forget that. I messaged Julia and I was like, I'm in the parking lot, and they just told me the detective is meeting with us too.
I said, oh,
did you bring your own
water bottle? They may be trying to get your DNA. Who is this guy who's so interested in this case?
Yep.
The interesting thing, in all honesty, when I first heard about the case, my initial reaction was, wow, this is so sad and tragic, and all these lives that were lost, and it looks like they have this clear suspect. But the thing, how, Julia, you talk about sometimes you just don't want the bad guy to get away with it. Yeah. The thing that got me was once I started seeing things like the classified ads in the other games he played, I was like, oh no, you are not smarter than me. That was my internal motivation. So it was a combination of it being so tragic and being a puzzle solver myself and being annoyed that he's playing those games. So that's what really drove me toward it. And the first question that they actually asked me when I showed up and we sat down at the table looking out, beautiful view of the Snake River at this old kind of like homey, really cool kind of restaurant, was, why would you fly across the country to look into this case? I was like,
I know.
It's the same question any investigator should ask.
And so, when we call into question people's behaviors about, they seem overly interested in it. Look at how popular true crime stories are and how people get so involved and invested in them, and they have nothing to do with them.
Yep.
But yet, we find certain people's behavior suspicious because they're interested in the case, or they volunteer, or they go into the police with a tip or whatever, and they become a suspect, and everybody jumps on them and pounces and thinks but it's like we're all doing the same thing.
Yes, right. Yes. As we do the exact same thing. Yes. Right.
So,
that guy was trying to be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We can't read into, you have to be careful reading too much into people's behaviors. We have to put it all in perspective.
Definitely.
All right. I hope it's solved. I really do. I think that's one of the hardest things for me, whether he's the one who did it or someone else did it. These crimes, a lot of them seem connected. And it kind of kills me to think that, like Betty White, Christina's mom, has passed away. So many, not everyone, Stephen Parasol still has family, Christina Nelson, I think Kristen David's sister's still around. There's still some family members, but it just kills me to think that these families aren't going to get some measure of justice, even if he spends 1 minute in jail.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Thank you so much, Julia. I consider this the little humanities wing of true crime. I got history, psychology, sociology, got all that,
Yeah,
so that's
I'm always happy
fun.
to join. It's always good to, refresher and talk about concepts and things like that, to keep my knowledge and skills sharpened.
Happy to help any way we can there, for sure.
Thank you.
All right.
Julia is, as always, such a great person to talk to. She and I will eventually be getting back together to cover the Black Dahlia case, and I am very much looking forward to that. I'll, of course, let you know well in advance when that's happening. As for where our time machine is heading from here, well, it's a surprise, but you can expect it to come wrapped in a bow and draped with tinsel. 'Tis the season, after all. If you have any questions, concerns, or observations, I would love to hear from you. Shoot me an email at vintagevillainsPod@gmail.com or head over to the Vintage Villains discussion group on Facebook and drop a post. Thanks again, as always, to my Patreon subscribers for keeping the time machine going. I'll be back again soon. In the meantime, get out there and make good history, and I'll see you next time in another century.